Hi, this is Dr. Chen, and this is a lecture for Chapter 13. So, we've talked about many different types of items this past couple of weeks, but we haven't discussed the type of assessment item that has been used for thousands of years and maybe even longer than that. Um, and this type of item provides us with the richest source of information available about human behavior, and it is called an interview. So, an interview is a set of questions that elicits answers about material that is typically not accessible through more traditional assessment techniques, such as multiple choice items, essay items, those kinds of traditional assessment items. We use the interview to basically get to know the story behind the story, to get a rich, detailed information, such as the motives, ideas, feelings, perceptions, and perspectives of someone. um, Interviews allow us to assess the broadest and richest of scales, but only if you ask the right questions and are a very good listener. So there are several different types of interviews for the exam. Make sure you know how to identify each type of interview based on the description given. So we're going to talk about highly structured interviews, also known as closed or fixed response interviews, guided interviews, also known as general interviews, and unguided interviews, also known as non-directive, unstructured, or conversational interviews. So be sure that you know the specific terms that are being used because this will likely be relevant for the quiz that will that you can take after this watching this lecture. Let's talk about highly structured interviews first. So a highly structured interview is like an oral questionnaire where the questions and the direction are predefined and all the interviewer needs to do is basically just ask away and record their responses. This is the type of interview format that will likely yield the most valid and reliable results. And so below are some example questions that you might find in a highly structured interview or a structured interview. Questions such as where were you born? Who was your favorite teacher? And why? When did you find yourself interested in science and what led you to study it in college? So again, these are sort of pre-populated items or questions that you would prepare beforehand, and you'd just basically go down the list. Um, so it's definitely not as flexible compared to other forms of interviews, but like I said before, this is the type of interview that will likely yield the most valid and reliable results, at least the way in which we define validity and reliability in previous chapters. In a guided interview, the interviewer guides the interviewee in a particular direction, and there's a beginning set of questions that is used along the way, but not necessarily in prescribed order. The interviewer is not necessarily restricted to a particular set of questions, but the questions are restricted to a specific subject area. These kinds of interviews are also called general interviews. So, for example, you might begin with a question such as, who do you believe has had the greatest influence on your education? And then this question might be followed up with, why do you believe this is the case? Why did you select education instead of some other field? And so you do have a set of pre-populated questions that you would ask at the beginning, and then depending on the response, you may have some flexibility in terms of what questions you might use as follow-ups. The main thing is that you stay within the specific subject area that you're wanting to interview on, and that would be the boundary to figure out what is going to be a relevant response versus what is going to be a non-relevant response. Then you have this last kind of interview, which is a non-directive or unguided interview. In this type of interview, there may be nothing other than a starting set of questions that the interviewer begins with, and then the individual being interviewed kind of takes it from there. And when I say takes it from there, we literally mean that the person being interviewed is given free rein to say and include whatever he or she thinks is necessary and pertinent. There is very little guidance from the interviewer, and these are also called unstructured or conversational interviews. So how do we do them? What are the guidelines to consider when doing interviews? So there are 13 that is mentioned, that is described in your chapter. Make sure for the exam that you study them and be thoroughly familiar with each guideline. So first, you need to do your homework. If you're interviewing someone about their work, read their work beforehand. Become familiar with their, say, for example, professional efforts or accomplishments or credentials. The thoroughness of your preparation is going to be a significant factor that determines the success or failure of your interview. Second, before you begin the interview process, you should probably explain the nature of the interview to the individual being interviewed. So, questions such as how long will it take? What kinds of questions will he ask? What should your interviewee do if he or she feels uncomfortable answering some of these questions? Will the results be shared, and if so, with who and how? All of these questions and a bunch more may be asked by the interviewee, and you probably want to have the answers beforehand, or at least answer them before you do the interview. Third, you want to practice like a lot. You probably are not going to be an expert when you first start out doing your interview, so take your time, practice on people other than the real interviewee, for instance, like your friends, family, or colleagues. And based on these practices, you can get a general sense of what types of questions might best lead to responses that are going to be useful. Fourth, make sure, especially if you're interviewing someone in the context of a scientific research study, that you do your best to maintain confidentiality. What does that mean? Well, basically what that means is that whatever the nature or the topic or content, whatever that's being said, none of it goes beyond you, and or the immediate need to know folks. So who are the need to know folks? Those are basically going to be your professional audience, as well as your professional colleagues who may be helping you in terms of peer review, and no one else. So you want to be really careful in who you share the details of the interview, because you want to ensure confidentiality if at all possible, especially within the research context. Fifth, you want to choose a setting wisely. If you want to interview someone, you want to pick a place where the interviewee is comfortable, that you're comfortable, where there is little to no distractions. So contrary to what some people might think, you probably don't want to interview someone at a coffee shop. It sounds like a relaxing atmosphere, but there's lots of distraction, lots of other cross-talking going on. So pick a place where there is some degree of privacy, so your interviewee is not having to decide, should I say this, should I not say this in a public setting. Six, you probably want to allow more time than you think you would need. Allow sufficient time for an interviewee to get to the place that you've identified, and also allow time for your interviewees to ask questions, or maybe even to answer open-ended questions that you might have. Because really, there's nothing more frustrating than being on the verge of a terrific answer and then you having to tell your interviewer, well, I guess time's up. We'll see you later. All right, seven, take plenty of notes. So even if you do have an amazing memory, you're probably much better off taking copious amounts of notes and even using a recording device of some kind. This allows you to take it back to your workplace or your lab and be able to transcribe it, so you can do a more in-depth analysis of the themes that might be emerging from your interview. You just gotta keep in mind that if you are using a recording device, that you get permission from the interviewee to use it. 8. Once you're done with your interview, stay in touch. Let the interviewee know that he or she can ask questions about any of the stuff that you all discuss in the interview. You can also let the interviewer know that you may contact him or her to follow up and maybe to get some clarification on a point or two. Sometimes when you go back and look at the transcriptions of your interviews, you may have one or two questions that you think might be useful to help clarify some things that may not be super clear. 9, you want to get them talking and keep them talking. This means that you talk less and listen more, but it also means that you continue to encourage them to talk more about important topics. So, you can encourage them by nodding and then asking them to continue if they stop, providing follow-up questions, pursuing leads, so on and so forth. 10th, realize that you as an interviewer, you set the tone and the direction of the interview. So as an interviewer, you want to be civil, polite, interested, or at least act that you are interested, or act as though that you're interested. You want to be on task, prepared, ready to answer questions, tolerant, and be focused on what you're doing. And so you're the interviewer. You set the tone and the direction and the boundaries, and you basically want to set up a setting where your interviewee can feel comfortable enough to say what he or she really thinks, but also be efficient in terms of answering the questions that you would want them to answer. 11th, feel free to use transitions to keep things going. One of the best ways is to simply summarize all the different thoughts and feelings that your interview shared with you and kind of collect them as though like you're collecting a bunch of flowers into a bouquet. Um, and typically, if you if you do it correctly, that signals to your interviewee that you're tracking along with them. And sometimes a good summary itself serves as a transition to keep things going, to have them keep talking. Or if you kind of want to shift gears and move on to something else, give that summary, that well thought out summary, and then transition to whatever that follow-up question might be. 12, you want to follow up when the opportunity presents itself. So sometimes it's hard to figure out when to jump in, when to ask for more clarification. And the trick over here is to kind of balance that line. You don't want to be completely quiet because sometimes silence is just going to encourage them to just keep talking or go in the direction in which you don't think is productive. Or if you were to stop them too many times or interrupt too many times, that may slow the momentum of the conversation itself. So it does take practice. You're not gonna get it perfect. You're gonna make mistakes, but you kind of wanna keep in mind. Just try to follow up whenever the opportunity presents itself. And 13, once the interview has ended, you want to write down any important observations or maybe even areas that you may want to follow up in subsequent interviews. Don't be afraid to ask permission to follow up through phone or email once you get back to your home office or lab. So now that we talked about all the 13 guidelines, let's talk about why your interview is good. So first, they provide obviously rich, detailed, and worthwhile information. The primary advantage of the interview is that it provides a whole lot of in-depth detail information that is often impossible to obtain using any other assessment technique. And second, interviews are personal. Give me a second. Okay. You going on with that? Yeah. Okay, have a good time. We're going to the playground. You're going to the playground? Okay, have fun. Thanks for saying bye. Bye. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye. Sorry about that. Where was I? So why are interviews good? So, first of all, they can provide a lot of information. I think I mentioned that already. And a lot of times, the amount of in-depth information that you can get is quite impossible for you to obtain through any other assessment technique. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. Interviews are unique in that way. Second, interviews are personal. Assessment procedures, the like the items that we talked about in previous chapters, they're usually pretty objective, and there's very little personal or human interaction that is involved. Interviews provide the opportunity to get the inside story, so to speak, and to really get to know the people being interviewed really well. So those are the two advantages of interviews. In a nutshell, interviews give you a more accurate picture of your interviewee's lived experience and to try to get as close as you can to that, if that is particularly important to you, that is. All right. On the other hand, interviews are not so good because they are subjective. So, in all fairness, in regards to this criticism, to call interviews subjective is to somewhat misunderstand the utility of this technique because, as I mentioned before, you typically use interviews when you are primarily interested in the lived experience of your interviewees, where the depth and the individualized perception of their experience is probably really important to you than getting data that is immediately generalizable to others. And so this really depends on the type of question that you have. And there are certain research questions, for example, that are better suited for interviews compared to like a multiple choice questionnaire. Second, keep in mind that interviews are time consuming. It takes a lot of time to prepare, schedule, administer, and analyze interviews. There's probably no way to get around this expense. You probably have to bite this bullet if you're shooting to do a really good in-depth interview to get some good data from that. And third, interviews allow very little generalizability. This is probably true, but if you do enough interviews on a, say, a circumscribed topic, such as through a structured or guided interview, and if you're very careful in assembling and analyzing your data, you may be able to get some generalizability in regards to the results of your analyses. So those are the three reasons why interviews are not so great. Again, I think this just kind of depends on what is your research question that you're wanting to answer, or the question that you're wanting to answer. Okay, so for the exam, be sure that you are familiar with the advantages and disadvantages of using an interview. Now, most assessment outcomes lend themselves to traditional analysis of the kind that you find in many of the traditional research reports that we talked about before in previous chapters. But interviews are a little bit different. They're not like that. So what you do with the rich, varied, and interesting and very personal answers that your interviews give you? Well, you can always create categories, code them, and count the types of responses that go under each category, and then do some hard work of interpretation in terms of making the connections between these categories. There are a bunch of different things that you can do in terms of qualitative analyses. This class is we're not going to have time to go into all the different ways in which you can do qualitative analysis. If you are interested, let me know. I can give you resources. We're just barely scratching the surface over here. Let's talk about interpretive analysis, which is one of the methods of organizing and analyzing your data after getting done with your interviews. At the end of each interview session in interpretive analysis, you would review the notes, the tapes, and other data, and then organize them, maybe perhaps with some type of pre-specified plan, and then write out your interpretation. And so it's almost like an ongoing iterative process. And so you do the interview, you review the data that you got from the interview, making categories and codes and such. And then this interpretation becomes a working hypothesis. You can generate a working hypothesis that you can then test in future interviewing sessions to get more information about how maybe certain variables are related to one another. After you've done sufficient interviews and a sufficient number of times in which you can quote unquote test your working hypothesis, you should arrive at a pretty good chunk of data that basically either support or don't support the specific relationships that you think exist in the topic that you're interested in. So really cool stuff, really important, especially for cross-cultural types of studies. Doing qualitative analysis is really helpful given that a big proportion of our psychological research studies are based on quantitative analysis, which has its pros and cons. So there's a space and time, day and time for you to do qualitative analysis through interviews. Now, all types of assessments and evaluative procedures involve ethical questions, but few are as personal or potentially harmful as direct one-on-one interviews. That is because, unlike such techniques, such as paper and pencil or public observation, the interviewer and interviewee are very closely tied in a personal and probably intimate experience, especially depending on what topic you're discussing. And so with that in mind, Brinkman and Cavalli, I think that's how I pronounce his name, I'm not too sure, lists many questions that need to be asked before, during, and after in the interview to help you to ensure high ethical standards. And so there are 6 questions that they suggest you should ask yourself. And I think these are fairly good questions for you to ask yourself before, during, and after the interview. So like, first of all, you probably want to ask yourself and your research team members, for example, what are the benefits of this study to both the interviewee as well as the community at large? Typically this is explicated prior to the study, so the prospective interviewees know as well what are the potential benefits of them participating in this interview. The second question that they can ask themselves is how can informed consent of the interview be assured? A lot of people tend to think that informed consent is kind of like a one-time deal. You tell your interviewee about what is the nature of this interview, the pros and cons, the risks, the benefits, and then you're done with that. But in reality, informed consent is a process throughout the entire interview and throughout the entire time in which you have interaction with your participants. You always want to be cognizant of potential situations where you might need to remind your interviewee of, say, the nature of the interview or the limitations to confidentiality, because he or she might not have thought about everything when you were talking about all when you were giving an overview of the interview at the beginning of the whole process. All right. Third, the third question that you can ask yourself is who should give such consent? The informed consent, that is. Is it the interviewee, the parents, or the supervisor? Keep in mind that the threshold age where an individual is considered a non-minor or an adult is about 18 years or older in most states, but you probably need to check. And especially if you're doing cross-cultural or international studies, you definitely want to figure out what is the age in which a person legally is able to give you proper informed consent. As opposed to minors, you typically provide assent after you get permission from their parents or their caregiver. Or maybe it's a supervisor if you're dealing with a vulnerable adult or vulnerable population. The fourth question that you can ask yourself is how can the identification of the interview be disguised, and how can the uh, anonymity of the interviewee be assured? This is going to be relevant, especially if you only have a small number of interviewees and you're interviewing them on a very specific, circumscribed topic. So, for example, if you're wanting to interview, say, male survivors of sexual assault in a particular high school in town, you should keep in mind of the probability that someone may be able to identify who the interviewee is simply based on a small number of interviewees that you worked with, as well as the specific types of responses that they have. And so typically in research studies, we say that we don't share uh, de-identified information in aggregate unless you have, say, about five or more. And it's a rule of thumb, but it's better than not having any type of guideline in regards to that. The fifth question that you can ask yourself is how will your role as an interviewer play or have any effect on the outcome of the interview? Keep in mind that your verbal and nonverbal messages that you convey intentionally or unintentionally will influence the types of responses that your interview makes. Young kids or vulnerable populations, for example, they are definitely much more prone to suggestibility, and they may inadvertently incorporate your expectations about the outcome of the interview in their responses if they can kind of sense what your working hypothesis is. This is actually a major limitation of interviews and really should be acknowledged throughout the interview process, throughout the analysis, as well as the when you're talking about the conclusions of the results that you can make from your interview. When you're having a conversation with someone, basically, keep in mind that you are kind of co-creating, like having some type of influence on the responses that your interview make. You do have that much power, whether you like it or not. So those are the five questions that you could ask yourself that I think does help steer you in the right direction to helping to make sure that your interview is done in an ethical manner. So in summary, interviews are a great way to obtain the lived human experience of your interviewees. It is a technique that is like no other because it allows you to delve deeply into a topic, get at a person's beliefs, and basically assess a host of topics that other methods cannot. So that's pretty much it for this chapter here on interviews. There are pros and cons to that, and there are some very good guidelines that are suggested by Selkai. Um, Congratulations, by the way, you have completed learning about different item formats, and now you're ready to learn about different tests. So we will be taking a long week break for Thanksgiving break after this, before we come back again and talk about the different types of tests such as intelligence and career choice tests, and so on and so forth. And so, if I don't hear from you, have a good break, and then we'll be in touch soon.